Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guests today are Cynthia Arnson and Michael Penfold. Cindy is the director of the Wilson Center's Latin American program, and Michael is the Abraham F. Lowenthal Public Policy Fellow with that same program, and he joins us from Venezuela, where he's a professor of political economy and governance with the Business and Public Policy School in Caracas. They join us to discuss the implications of the recent elections in Venezuela. Cindy, Michael, thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Thanks for the invitation, John.
Thanks, John. Pleasure.
Michael, if we could begin with you on the ground in Venezuela, what has been the reaction, I'm wondering, among the general populace? Are citizens reacting to the election the same way people are around the globe?
No, quite the contrary. I mean, the elections for the legislative branch have been a huge failure in terms of political participation. And the opposition, because of the electoral conditions with that, did not help to hold a free and fair election, decided to boycott the whole process. And the result of that has been that almost 70% of voters did not vote. And the new assembly now has an overrepresentation from Maduro of almost 90% of the seats. So the outcome doesn't really help in any way for Venezuela to solve a very deep institutional crisis in a moment where the rest of the world does not recognize the presidency and will not recognize at the same time the new legislative body. And but it is also true that the results also show that citizens are tired. Here we're living through a dramatic humanitarian and complex crisis, and people are becoming disillusioned, not only with Chavismo, but also with the opposition. Mm-hmm. They're fed up of a gridlock that are not taking into account their own welfare in a country that is increasingly isolated from the rest of the world, with over 90% of the people living in poverty. Which means that people just don't see elections as anything significant that will improve their standard of living or allow them to access needed food and medicines in the context of COVID-19.
So Cindy, where does this leave the opposition? Certainly with many less seats, and the decision to sit out, I imagine, was made because they didn't think it was going to be fair anyway, and damned if you do, damned if you don't. But where does this leave the opposition now?
Well, for one thing, it leaves the opposition, as Michael was saying, in a certain respect, irrelevant to the central needs that people have, which is to put food on their table and to have running water and electricity. And the opposition has not been able to deliver any of those things or to show that it really has a plan to improve the quality of life for people. It has focused a lot in these last 2 years on mobilizing international condemnation of the Maduro regime, which it wholly deserves. But which has not, been effective on the ground. And so now I think there are a lot of divisions, which I think Michael can talk to with greater authority, people who are really looking back and saying we need to reassess where we are going forward. Interim President Juan Guaido has committed to staying within Venezuela and to continuing the struggle, but he's not the only effective or leader of the opposition. There are other people who have a different approach to how political work should go on under this authoritarian regime. And I think it's also important to point out that Juan Guaido emerged out of the National Assembly, which since 2015 has been controlled by the opposition. And now that that 5-year constitutional period is over, it's very difficult to say that there's a constitutional basis for Guaido to continue as interim president. he and his party argue that the Constitution talks about the interim president preparing the way for free and fair elections. And since that has not taken place, his claim to the interim presidency remains. But there's,
So does he just go away, Cindy? What happens to Mr. Guaido?
well, he certainly doesn't go away. He will be within, Venezuela, trying to organize as best he can, but also, I think, under great threat. The other major leader of his party, Leopoldo Lopez, was in jail for several years, was released to house arrest, and then escaped to a foreign embassy for asylum, and now has been able to get out of the country. And the regime has shown no scruples in terms of arresting people, throwing them in jail, and using them as an object lesson of what you should expect if they try to oppose the government.
Michael, Cindy referenced these growing divisions and said you're in a position to expand on those. Could you do that?
Yeah, I think the opposition is getting divided. It's really divided on how to achieve a political transition that does not arrive. And I think part of the opposition believes that the Guaido interim presidency has failed basically because it has hoped to basically break up the military and dislodge Maduro from power. And that's not been the case. And it's not been the case in part because the military fears a political change that is led by the US and the international front, where they perceive that they have no guarantees of how that political change will affect what are very deep corporate interests, because this is a military like in other countries like Pakistan or Egypt, for example, where the military controls large sectors of the economy. So it's a powerful actor, and that actor so far has is not willing to sort of allow that process without some kind of previous negotiation. On the other hand, I think
I'm sorry. Excuse me, Michael. You go right ahead.
But on the other hand, there are other sections or other wings within the opposition that are more moderate, that also perceive that this idea that even though electoral conditions are not free and fair, that this idea of boycotting elections is not helping to mobilize the discontent on behalf of the population, and that therefore the opposition is losing huge opportunities to mobilize these grievances to the streets, and under that pressure, sort of put the country to discuss and to change these electoral conditions to lead to some kind of pacted or gradual a process of political transition. Obviously, part of this is the result of the way how a foreign policy, particularly U.S. foreign policy, has been designed towards Venezuela, because the U.S. has been pushing for what they have called the maximum pressure strategy to break up the military, and I think that has also hindered the whole ability of the different actors to come to the table and reach some type of agreement. That doesn't mean that that's going to happen. It could have happened a year ago when Guaido was still had very high rates of approval. Today he's in a much weaker position, and therefore the chances of a substantial or a substantive negotiation process are much lower than they were a year ago.
What I started to ask you, and I apologize for interrupting, but you then went on to speak about it, was this decision by the opposition to sit out the election. I wonder what both of you think of that with the benefit of hindsight. Was that tactically the right call or the wrong call?
I think it generates huge dilemmas, particularly for some foreign countries that have been supporting Guaido. Europe does recognize the old assembly as legitimate, as the only democratic institution left in the country. But the reality is that the constitutional period of the legislative branch is coming to an end on January 5th. And therefore, the possibility of recognizing the interim presidency without a real democratic, a renewed National Assembly becomes very difficult given, the kind of precedents that this will create at the international level. So many countries are reluctant to continue being strong supporters, let's say, of this idea that there is an interim government, that even though they recognize Guaidó, they recognize the legitimacy of the old assembly, they're reckoning with the fact that that despite that, in the internal front, Maduro has continued to consolidate power, and that therefore the international strategy that so far has been implemented, particularly with the US, is failing on several counts.
Cindy, and all of this comes in the US at a time of transition between President Trump and a President Biden. So far, most of the US reaction we've heard from Mike Pompeo. What will happen as far as the US response? And do you expect continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration?
I think, John, that's a good question. I think initially there will be some degree of continuity. There will continue to be a condemnation of these elections as, as far from free and fair as you could imagine. And it wasn't, only that, that the, access to communications and this sort of thing. I mean, this is an election in which the government replaced the leaders of the opposition political parties and prohibited them from running, and the Supreme Court, interfered. The Electoral Council, made it really miserable. So the opposition was truly between a rock and a hard place. Although, it resembles what happened in 2005 when the opposition again boycotted, and the result was exactly the same, which is that the governing party, holds the majority. And it was really only when they changed that strategy that the opposition was able to win the assembly elections in 2015. So going forward under this government, the conditions are going to really remain very, very restrictive. What the Biden administration has been on record saying is that they don't want the sanctions policy to be the sort of be all and end all of what the United States does. They've talked about using sanctions in a more intelligent way. I think they will try to look for ways that there can be some kind of adjustment in the sanctions to improve the humanitarian situation in the country and facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid. They will certainly look to increase the amount of assistance that is being given to Venezuela's neighbors, particularly Colombia, also Peru, Ecuador, that are have accepted, millions, literally millions of Venezuelan refugees that have fled, these multiple crises. But really, attempting or looking, other than very discreetly, towards a negotiation, I think is a ways off. And they're going to have to see some strong signs from people in and around, the Maduro government, that there is a basis for negotiations that have failed in the past, and which the US has supported and which really have led nowhere because the regime feels that there's really, nothing in it for them. Why cede power? And effectively, they are stronger now than they were 2 years ago.
Along those lines, Michael, with the resistance that Nicolas Maduro has and the persistence that he has shown in staying in power, and his resistance to foreign actors who would like to see him step away, where does that leave the people of Venezuela in terms of how the national or the international community relates to Venezuela? What is the proper role for external players in helping the people and promoting the notion of democracy?
Well, the people are left in a very dire situation with a dysfunctional political system, an economy that has basically lost 2/3 of its GDP. It's certainly their largest economic depression in Latin America's modern history, and one that is now lasted more than 6 years. with more than 90% on living in poverty, with a middle class that is right now poor, and more importantly, with inequality levels that are at the level of Haiti. And this is in a country that used to be the top oil producer in the Western Hemisphere, that used to be also one of the most consolidated democracies in the region. So people are left without a voice and without representation, and in a very difficult economic and social situation. Now, what should the international response to this be? Well, I think, as Cindy was suggesting, I think first of all that the international community should continue exercising pressure, but in a more intelligent way. And I think that needs to address in a more realistic fashion what the reality in the ground is. And I think at the end, the veto player, or the most important player sustaining the current status quo, is the military. But on the other hand, the international community has to recognize that Chavismo is and will continue to be a very important political force in Venezuela. So you need to work with guarantees. You need to offer, and you you have to push less and pull more. And that means basically that the U.S. needs to start working on something which I think they have not been very good at under the Venezuelan situation, in a more multilateral fashion, more aligned with Europe and Europe with the US, and also including other regimes that have been helping Maduro to stay in power, and such as China, for example, and Turkey, and even Russia, and obviously Cuba. So this, at the end, you need to work on two levels. On the one hand, at the international level, we need to create a second floor of nations that agree that some kind of negotiated outcome should be promoted, and that there is coordination among all these international actors in helping Venezuela reach some type of agreement that is both inclusive and that also allows the country in the long term to build stable institutions that can help reconstruct the economy. On the other hand, you need a first level of negotiation process, which is going to be more complex, that Venezuela had last year, but regretfully it collapsed, which was a negotiation process that was mediated by Norway, and both sides abandoned. So you now need to restore that, but you need to restore that opening up the representation on behalf of the opposition to other groups, and not only the Guaido camp. And on the side of the regime, you need to open up this to other factors also within the regime that need to be sitting down in that table, particularly, I think, the military as a key actor. And at the end, you need to build a very complex institutional sort of agreement that allows for transitional justice, that allows for an electoral calendar that can be oversight by the international community, and also that allows for the humanitarian assistance to come into Venezuela in an orderly way. I think this is the way to move forward. It's going to take time to do that, but I think that's the kind of policy that will eventually work, and it's basically the only outcome left for Venezuela to restore its own viability, both politically, socially, and economically.
Cindy, I want to get some final thoughts from you as well. And Michael's preaching patience, and it's hard to imagine that pre-pandemic there was a moment where a lot of the world was thinking the possibility of Maduro stepping aside was even imminent at certain moments, and we've come a long way from that. What do you see as far as the way forward?
I would agree with Michael that there's no collapse of this regime through external pressure, or even a combination of internal and external pressure. That has really been the focus of the opposition strategy, the Trump administration strategy over the last couple of years, and it hasn't worked. In fact, it's failed rather spectacularly. But I think it's also important to underscore that one of the major critiques of any negotiated settlement is the degree of, criminality, not just human rights abuse, which has been terrible, torture and assassinations and whatever, but also the degree of corruption and the involvement of people in the military and in the regime in general, in organized crime and other kinds of things. This is not to say that it's worse in Venezuela than in other places, but it is bad.
Thank you for a terrific conversation and for bringing us up to date on the situation. My thanks to both Cynthia Arnson and Michael Penfold. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again for another episode. In the meantime, we wish you a happy and healthy holiday, and let's go on to 2021 and hope for better things. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.